Hello, and welcome to episode 30 of the Power Spurred LSAT podcast. This is John Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Cloran in Napa Valley.
Yes, sir. We got a special one today, Dave, but before we dive into it, how's it going up there?
It's always outstanding, although there is the threat of fire in my vicinity, and that's always a scary proposition.
Always something. Always something. Well, you'll be shocked to learn there's no threat of anything down here. Maybe a cloud one of these days?
Yeah, but in about 2 months, then you'll be dealing with the Santa Anas, and that's when you get the fire threat.
I'm surrounded by concrete, so there's no real threat to me.
Well, Bel Air
But yeah,
burned
I guess
up last year.
Bel Air, sometimes some smoke is visible. That's about as much threat as I see.
Yeah, so I won't be making any fire-related jokes or taking shots of Fireball or anything like that. I do not mess with the fire and wind gods.
The fire gods.
Yes.
Fair enough. Well, no shots of Fireball. What are you drinking?
Well, in light of the discussion topic of today, which is are logic games disappearing from the LSAT,
That's right.
I am drinking a screwdriver
Emphasis on
on the screw part, and then being driven home, because that feels like what might be happening here. But it's a special version. It's Tito's vodka, and I didn't have any orange juice, but there was Sunny D around, so it's special.
You make do. What you got?
It's really sweet.
I always like Tito's vodka because it's made in Austin, Texas, which is not the place you would expect to find like a really quality vodka.
Yeah, it's like, what is it, distilled or, I don't know, sanitized like 6 times it goes through?
Yeah, cold distilled or some sort of thing they do. My favorite part about Tito's vodka is the owner's name, the namesake. His name is Tito Beverage.
Exactly.
Yeah. I ran into him years ago before Tito's vodka was really even a thing in an Austin bar. And he's just kind of this affable, kind of gray-haired, scruffy dude. And we started talking. I ordered like I don't even know, kettle and soda or something. And he said something about the vodka. He's like, "You like that stuff?" And I was like, "Vodka?" He's like, "No, kettle." He told me a little bit about him making vodka, but of course at the time I was like, "This guy's a kook."
You're probably making it out of your garage.
Little did I know. Yeah, I think he basically was. Like the early Apple days. Little did I know Mr. Beverage was going places.
I remember actually special ordering it in Hilton Head.
They didn't have it there yet?
They did not. I'd read about it in some marketing thing and was really fascinated with the story. And I was like, I want to try it. And they didn't have it, but they got it by special order a couple weeks later. And I was like, well, it tastes pretty good. And then it wasn't much longer after that it became widespread.
Didn't you order a pallet of Hoegaarden beer after we got back from Amsterdam?
I've done this with Red Bull as well.
It
turns out that I'm on the bleeding edge.
The bleeding edge.
Of various drinks, often alcohol related.
Yeah, bleeding edge, another appropriate metaphor for today.
I think I've told that story where the first time I encountered Red Bull, I'd never knew what it was, and so I had 6 of them in one night.
I think you told that in an earlier podcast episode.
Things that I regret, but how could I have known what it was? No one even knew what an energy drink was. Anyway, let's move on from that. What are you drinking tonight?
Oh, what am I drinking? I'm not sure which of these is the prime ingredient, tequila or tears. And I've got a couple of shots of tequila lined up here, and so if you hear me semi-choke throughout this, that's what I'm up to.
If I hear you crying, I'll know what you're refilling your glass with.
That's right. Yeah, if my tequila needs salt, I'm going to self-produce it. It's a sad day, potentially. We'll see.
We'll see. We'll talk about that in a moment.
Which leads to the song, really.
Yes, it does. What is our song tonight?
Oh, good old Bill Withers song. An oldie but a goodie. Ain't No Sunshine.
When You're Gone.
Is the rest of that part of the title officially? I thought it was just Ain't No Sunshine.
I thought it was Ain't No Sunshine When You're Gone.
That's the lyric. When she's gone. That's the lyric. But I think the title of the song is just Ain't No Sunshine.
Well, let's just say that it is, and that the she in this case is Logic Games.
That's right. Analytical reasoning. Fun fact about that song, if you look at Michael Jackson's debut album, Got to Be There, 71, 72, he covers it. I'm not sure he does Bill justice, but he covers it. So there you go.
Interesting choice.
We'll link to that song if you guys want to weep with us.
All right, let's transition to the LSAT world because it seems like there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, the one and only category for today. We do this every week, but usually as a preface to something else. Not today.
No, today it will all be focused on this, and it'll be the last of the topics that is the most interesting. But let's run through a few things that are happening.
Sure.
The first is that The LSAT score release is coming up here on Monday, October 14th.
Yep, September scores. And the fun thing about the September test, if you could call it that, is you'll get a copy of it. If you're waiting on your score on the 14th, you're actually going to get a copy of the test content and your answers, all inclusive with the score, which is cool.
And it's interesting because you'll be able to see the infamous logic game section.
That's right.
That exam.
Again, if you took it, obviously.
Yeah. You'll be able to review it at your leisure.
Right.
But scores should start rolling out around 9 a.m. Eastern time. And it does take a little bit of time. So if you don't get it immediately, don't panic. It will take a few minutes for all the scores to go out, usually several hours. But they've gotten faster in recent administration. So usually by about 2 hours afterwards, the majority of people, if not, almost all of them have their score.
Yeah, so that's one of the two big things next week. The other being,
you can now register for the November test later than it was previously. It has been moved back to October 15th. And this is a really welcome change because it means if you get your score on the 14th, you still have the ability to go ahead and register for November if you wish to do so.
And if you have an open center, by the way.
Yeah, and if you have availability.
Right.
Previously, the registration deadline was closing prior to the score release, and that was a mistaken move on their part. They finally corrected it. The only regret that I have here is why not correct it a long time ago? Instead, you had people who were literally registering like a day or two before this announcement came out, and they're like, well, maybe I don't need to. I just did this to kind of protect myself. And then when they go to get their money back, they'll only get $50 back. Yeah. And so it really has this unfair feel that maybe LSAC should think about refunding those people because this is a kind of a special circumstance. If you registered within a day or two of that announcement, I think you should get your money back. However, that's just my opinion, and we know that they won't take it.
Yeah, I mean, wishful thinking is going to be a theme throughout, I think, today.
Let's move to the next agenda item, which is that they did come out with another of their Law: Fully blogs. I thought this one was interesting, even though it doesn't focus quite so much on the LSAT. The name of the blog was Key Skills Needed for Law School and How They Continue to Shape the LSAT. So the first part is about skills, and then they reference the LSAT, and they do talk about some of the things they might do, but as you would expect, they don't get specific. Mm-hmm. But the thing that was interesting to me was they talked about a survey that they had done of law schools mm-hmm. and what they were looking for successful students. And so they're going to release this report later on, and I think then things will be a little bit clearer. But they talked about, I'll quote them, out of 70 different skills evaluated, the top 10 skills needed for success in law school, according to the law school faculty who participated in the survey, include. Mm-hmm. And then the very first one is reading critically. And it says that 92% of those surveyed said this is highly important.
So this is basically like Family Feud style, right? Like top 5 answers on the board. We surveyed 100 people.
They gave them 70 possible options, and here's the top 10.
Right.
And I'll just read a couple. I'm not going to read them all. Reading critically was the first. Applying a case, rule, principle, or statute to a new or hypothetical set of facts is second at 90%. Identifying the principle, rule of law, or statute operating in or applicable to a case is third at 89%. Then identifying the key facts in a case, and so on.
Yeah.
And it goes down. And these are all, the top 10 are all 80% or above. And the thing was, at first I looked at that and I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And then I started to think to myself, let's take a look at that very first number. And there's 2 interesting points about it. Reading critically. 92% thought that was important. And that sounds like, okay, yeah, it's very important. Who were the 8% that didn't think it was
Why is it
important?
only 92%?
Yeah, why isn't this 100%? Like, reading is a critical skill if you want to be a lawyer, and certainly if you want to succeed in law school. But reading critically isn't considered to be that important by everyone.
So now, what that 8% means, if I'm understanding this correctly, is out of the 70, pick your top 10, basically, for each faculty member. 8% didn't put reading critically in their top 10. Am I reading that right? Is that?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
We don't know yet. It could have been one of those things where they said choose all that apply. In fact,
if that's the case, then how is it 8%? If it's you have to just select a small portion of these, then I could see maybe other skills getting ranked higher by a handful of people.
It could be that it's the language that was used in the survey, because
Right.
the wording here is interesting. 92% of those surveyed said this is highly important.
Uh-huh.
So you could have had 92% say it's highly important, and then the remaining 8% say that it's just important.
Right.
Which tells me that the survey and the way that it was conducted is going to be, a point of some interest when this is actually released, and could be, conceivably, I don't know, it could be prejudicial here in terms of how people responded. They might not have felt that they were actually saying anything bad. They're like, yes, it's very important, or it is important. Something else was highly important. Then it becomes more of a relativistic thing and how they made those choices. But here's one, reading class materials. Only 85% of people said that that was highly important. So there's 15% of faculty out there that think that, who cares if you read? It's just not that important. It's not as important as other things. Or
it's not highly important, I think would be the most precise way to put that.
It is, but I'd prefer to
I know, exaggerate
make it
a little bit.
more exaggerated because it's more
this
fun.
This feels like a classic LSAT survey flaw, is what this feels like.
It was my first thought. I was like, we just had been talking about flaws in the reasoning, and here we have one that we don't know yet.
Potentially, we'll
we
have to see
it.
the final report. But
now, they went on from there to do something that I thought was fascinating. They took a shot at other tests, which is, this is a new attitude. They've got a new administration over there, and credit to the new administration. They're more aggressive. I think they're looking to make changes. It's not the passive mindset of the past. And so I appreciate that from the new people over at LSAC.
Me too.
But you don't often see this happen from them, or at least you just didn't see it in the past. It says, skills measured by, and I'll quote, other standardized tests, such as basic algebra, geometry, and vocabulary, are viewed by law school faculty as far less relevant. So once again, when you took a look at the highly important statistic, basic algebra was only rated as highly important by 4% of the faculty. Basic geometry only by 2%. Interpreting basic graphs was only 8%. And so here they're saying what we test is really considered important, and then what other tests are into, which is basically math, not really important at all.
So, the question that may not need asking, what test do you think they were specifically taking shots at here?
GRE.
Uh-huh.
We know the GRE's
1,000%, yeah.
That incursion into the law school admissions sphere. So, and there'll be more conversation about that because we don't talk about it as much anymore because it's been an ongoing process. But law schools, still monthly, every other month, are adding themselves to the roster of institutions that accept the GRE, and I don't see it going away.
No.
Which actually makes the next thing we're going to talk about, I think, a little bit more interesting, even just in that context.
Sure.
So, regardless, LSAC gives us a breakdown of skills that law school faculty think are important. And interestingly enough, a lot of them don't think certain skills that I would assume are highly important actually are. And then just for good measure, they lob a few bombs at tests like the GRE and also the GMAT.
And the GMAT too, yeah.
Yeah, there's at least one school out there that's accepting the GMAT now. And I'm sure there'll be more. They'll want to get in on the party as well. Everybody wants, and I hate to say it, the money that applicants are generating in test fees and all sorts of things like that. So that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Anyway, anything else happen this week, John?
No, let's wrap this up.
Oh, wait. There actually was a
Dare
press
to dream.
release.
Dare to dream.
Dare to
We could
dream.
end right now.
I would love it. 10 minutes and we're done.
Yeah.
There was a press release that came out, and it was dated yesterday, but basically came out today in terms of widespread distribution. And the press release is called The Statement on the Amicable Resolution of Bino versus LSAC Lawsuit. And the subtitle is Blind Plaintiffs and LSAC End Litigation and Agree to Work Cooperatively to Enhance the Opportunities for Persons with Visual Impairments Who Want to Attend Law School. Now, on the face of it, when you read that, your first thought is, okay, they had an accommodations lawsuit, and after what turns out to have been quite a long time, they have
7 or 8 years, I think. Yeah.
resolved it. But what caught our eye was not that so much, because there's been various accommodations lawsuits with LSAC. I mean, they had an issue with California, the Federal Department of Justice. They had a consent decree with them. They've gone around this before. So at first it looks like, okay, there's another accommodations issue, and they've finally finished that off. Except that there's something in the middle of it that is, I mean, if you're an LSAT taker, or certainly if you're what we do, it would be life-changing. Test-changing in the future, life-changing for you and I, John, if this actually were to come to fruition, as it were.
Yeah. If we live long enough to see this, then this could absolutely shake the foundations of what we do.
Yeah, so...
And it's announcements like this that make me wonder if I will live long enough to see it.
Well, let's read the section that's actually...
You want to read it?
I'm not going to read the whole lawsuit,
No, of course not.
It's quite lengthy. First off, it is worth noting that this press release has been provided by Nyman Turkish law firm. Mm-hmm. So it is done in connection with LSAC, because it says that it comes from Southfield, Michigan, where the plaintiff is, and Newtown, Pennsylvania. And it also provides contacts, both the Jason Turkish, the lawyer who represented the plaintiff, and an LSAC contact at the bottom. So this is clearly in relation to LSAC. Whether or not they wrote the text, I mean, I don't think that they did, but they may very well have approved it.
They approved it, as I understand. I think the law firm put the text out, but LSAC was involved in the final approval process of it.
It would be very unlikely that they would release this without some kind of foreknowledge of it, with their name all over it. Yes. But what had happened is that the plaintiff, Angelo Bino, and another plaintiff, Shalisha Taylor, they were sight impaired and blind, and so Mr. Bino was arguing that trying to take the logic game section, the analytical reasoning section, was unfair. He's like, I can't diagram it. And it turns out that LSAC talks about using diagrams a lot when they explain how to do logic games. And so they move forward. But as part of the supposed resolution of this case, and I'm going to say supposed because we don't have the details, nor do I think we're going to get them. I would imagine that the settlement agreement in this case is under a confidentiality order, that we probably will never see the exact language of it unless LSAC chooses to release that to us.
Right.
So everything that we're talking about here is either based on this press release or it's, logical supposition that follows therefrom.
Sure.
But several paragraphs down at the end, after we've been talking about the analytical reasoning section and some of the problems, there is a sentence that says, and I will quote, consistent with the parties' agreement, LSAC will complete this work. This is kind of like changing the sections within the next 4 years, which will enable, that's a key word right there, all prospective law school students to take an exam administered by LSAC that does not have the current analytical reasoning / logic game section, but continues to assess analytical reasoning abilities. Now, as you might imagine, on the discussion forums today, what this generated was an immediate set of posts that logic games is disappearing in 4 years.
Yeah. 4 years maximum, by the way.
Yeah, they could do it.
That's a deadline, not a date.
That's a good way to put it. They could do it next year if they wanted to. Am I saying that they'll do it next year? No, so everybody chill out. Now, this is really interesting because I think you and I have so many thoughts, it's actually hard to organize them. The first one is it real?
Yeah. What to make of this in the very first place.
Yeah.
In an effort to try to establish a bit more clarity, because listen, I think we can both agree on this, Dave, and anyone who just heard Dave read that or has read it would likely agree as well. This was not the most unambiguous document that I've ever read. That sentence alone that you just read is open, in my opinion, to multiple interpretations as to how it could play out, come to fruition, how you could essentially satisfy all the language in that sentence through more than one potential outcome.
Let's talk about that first and then link back in some of the other articles that came out about this, because I think they actually add different views to the situation.
Yeah, let's deconstruct that statement. And it's funny you emphasized a word in there that I do think actually deserves some more scrutiny, and that's the word enable. We'll get to words like all in a second. It will enable, as it says. The big debate that I've seen from people is that the same thing as require or mandate or force? Does enabling people to take a test without logic games equate to basically saying that everyone will now get a new LSAT form or new LSAT construction that no longer has logic games? You're enabled to do a lot of things, but does that necessarily mean you have to do them? That's, I suppose, the first part of this debate.
Yeah, I think the example that you had used before was everybody is able to use the high occupancy vehicle lane.
On a highway, yeah.
Yeah, but do they have to, or are they forced to? No, they just have the option of being able to access it as needed. They are enabled to access it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say that now everybody must use the high occupancy vehicle lane. And that was an example that you actually threw out there. And my first reading of this was just that what was being said was, there was an open door here in terms of like what they would offer people. Mm-hmm. You now have the opportunity versus we're changing the test for everybody.
Right. Now, of course, the natural outcome of that or conclusion from that is, do we really see them putting a situation out there where 100,000+ people a year get to pick and choose?
No.
No. So I think interpreting enable as, listen, we're going to give you a choose your own adventure style LSAT, experience. That's not going to happen.
It's not. And the thing that kind of followed up on that was later on in this press release, and this is certainly what lends a big sheen of credibility to this whole discussion, is there's a quote from Kelly Testy, who is the president of LSAC. And when I read her quote, my first thought was she left the door wide open as to what would occur. So I'm going to read that, mm-hmm. and then we'll kind of compare and contrast these two sections. So what she said, let me get to it here really quick. She said that diversity and equal opportunity are vital in legal education and legal profession. To help promote those goals, here's where we get to the interesting part. Mm-hmm. LSAC is committed to ensuring that disabled individuals can take our exam in an accessible place and manner. All right, that's good.
That's great.
That the LSAT is fair for all test takers.
Mm-hmm.
Fine. And that we support everyone interested in pursuing law school. We greatly appreciate the willingness of Mr. Bino and Ms. Taylor and their attorneys to work collaboratively with LSAC to resolve their concerns. She doesn't say anything about changing the test.
No.
That just is, we're going to be fair and accessible, and we want to support people's ability to access the law.
Sure.
There's no discussion in there that suggests that we're going to change the test in any appreciable way.
Wholesale for everyone.
Yeah.
So let's circle back to enable and talk about another, and I think, again, the HOV lane analogy probably holds here as well. The other part of this is the HOV lane's available to everyone. You're not forced to use it. In other words, there's no requirement. But to use it, you have to qualify. In other words, it's available with an asterisk, basically. The asterisk of the HOV lane is you have to have a passenger, or in some places, 2 or more. In this case, the other way that I think you could say enable people to take this test, it's available to all people, is to say, sure, it's available to all people, just like that car lane. But to get a form without the logic games, you actually have to qualify in the same way that extra time is available to all test takers, if you can prove that you deserve it.
So it seems like it's kind of open. When you read the press release, it's kind of directed towards that. And then Kelly Testy's comment doesn't even address it. And I think we'll come back to this in a moment. Yeah. What further kind of like fomented the rebellion, as it were, was that there was another article from a Detroit website called Click on Detroit. And in this very short and not exactly well-proofed article, there is an additional set of comments that are much more direct in terms of what this means. And it says, 8 years of legal back and forth, and now the makers of the LSAT test have settled this lawsuit. And then I quote, they are removing the drawing portion, That's Logic Games.
Yeah.
For all students, not just those with disabilities. That is a very direct statement. And then there is a quote from the attorney. It says, you know what's amazing about this case? It took longer to settle because Angelo, that's Angelo Bino, the plaintiff, insisted it wouldn't be just for him. So as you look at that, those two statements make it really sound like that's it for Logic Games. Mm-hmm. It's over and done with. And obviously, we were taking a look at this and we said, well, let's find out for ourselves.
Yeah, I want to say about that Detroit article, that is not an officially sanctioned LSAC approved, LSAC vetted article.
Yeah, good point. And then, by the way, Above the Law came out with a further article today. And Above the Law is a pretty well-known website that focuses a lot on law firms, but definitely delves into the LSAT world. They came out, but their article is quite clearly, at least to me, based upon these two sources that we're talking about. So I didn't feel like anything that was written was a deviation from this. But obviously, we're sitting here, John and I are talking about it. We're like, what's up? This press release is not exactly clear. Then this badly written article is very, very clear, but then calls the section the drawing section. Like, what, dude? Do you LSAT?
Do you LSAT?
Mood was unhappiness at that point when I read that drawing section. What the hell? And so we said, let's reach out to both groups. And this started off, this was our day start. And so I reached out to LSAC and John reached out to Jason Turkish, who was the lead attorney on this for
the plaintiffs.
The plaintiffs. John, how did your conversation with Mr. Turkish go?
It went really well, and far less ambiguously, I suppose, than the article would lead one to potentially interpret. And I want to make clear before I even get into this two things. One, we're just talking about potential interpretations. None of these that we've mentioned so far, with the word enable, the word all, are necessarily what I think are what I would call like a my bet. So the idea that maybe it'll just be for accommodated people versus not, I'm not coming down on one side of that or the other. I'm just saying there seem to be multiple sides. Right? Does that make sense?
Totally.
Yeah. I don't want anyone to read this and be like, oh, so those guys think it'll just be this or just be that. I have not formed any hard conclusions quite yet.
I think we've actually wavered.
Yeah.
Early on I was skeptical. Then I read the press release and I was like, yeah, I'm more skeptical. She doesn't say anything about it. And I respect what Kelly Testi has to say. She's not, she's not just going to throw out something new was my presumption.
Same boat. Exact same boat. Yeah.
Yeah. Then I read the article that was on this website in Detroit and I was like, boy, that is incredibly direct. And then when you talked to Jason Turkish, I think we were like, so tell us a little bit about that conversation.
And this is part number two, and you mentioned this before, that some of this is bound up by confidentiality agreements. So he could only say so much, and I'll be, I think, both respectful and discreet in trying to quote him too much, because I don't want to put him on the spot or misrepresent him and what he told me. Most of what he told me essentially was, listen, read the press release. The press release says what it says. I can only speak to the press release. But, and this was the quote over and over, and I appreciated him actually emphasizing this, quote, all means all. Essentially, not just accommodated people, no asterisks, no footnotes, not just people who qualify for visual impairment or some other reason. All means all, as in everyone is going to get a new version of this test that does not have the current version of the Logic Games section.
In other words, as they walk away from the settlement of the lawsuit, their belief is that Logic Games is indeed going away at some point in the next 4 years.
Yes, that was his intent behind releasing that article. That's how he feels the case was settled. And again, if I'm misquoting him, I don't think that I am. I apologize. But that to me was the interpretation of the plaintiff side of this, is that within 4 years, the Logic Game section, as it currently exists, would no longer exist, no longer be present on the test for anyone. All means, again, to quote, all means all. So I introduced to him the fact that, listen, some people are debating the difference between a word like enable versus a word like require. The new test will enable everyone versus require everyone. He didn't see that distinction as being as problematic, I think, as some people have taken it to be. All means all. I presented that as, listen, alternative interpretation could very well mean that, yeah, it's available for all people. And I gave him the HOV lane example. That's available too, but only under certain circumstances, right? That was not how he saw this shaking out.
But he was also, I think, very careful in terms of what he was saying.
Very precise in how he framed
he was not trying to over disclose information, and so anything that is said here that might be, wait, did he say that? That would be on our, misinterpretation as opposed to him crossing any lines.
Yeah, no. If anything gets shared here, it's because I have jumped the fence, so to speak.
So as they walked away from this, they felt that was the case.
Yes.
Now, do we know how LSAC feels? No, we don't, because, well,
how did your phone calls go today, Dave?
Well, you were having these conversations.
Very productive conversations, I should say. Very friendly and lengthy conversations.
Yeah, and Jason is apparently a really, really nice guy,
Great
super
guy.
friendly.
Yeah,
that's kind of cool to know. My conversations with LSAC were less than productive. I reached out to a couple contacts, including Melissa Harris-Thirsk, who is the listed LSAC contact. The response that I didn't get a response from her because I had just left a message. And at this point, LSAC is long closed today, so we're not going to get a response back. And I reached out to some other contacts who acknowledged, hey, something has happened, and I'm going to go talk to our communications people and our marketing people, which is basically Melissa Thirsk and her team. And that was the last I heard. So is that unusual? No. I know that other people in this field were reaching out to them as well and getting the same response. And so...
Non-response, really, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Although, as Rush says, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice.
Fair enough.
So if you choose not to respond, you're still sending a message. I mean, to be entirely honest, I'm just surprised by this. There's a couple different theories that we'll go through in terms of like what this means. But my first thought was you're being asked directly as to whether or not a change, which you seem to somewhat have agreed to with this press release, which you knew about,
right,
was coming out. It's got your name all over it. You're a contact point person for this. How do you not have an answer ready to go? How is it that we once again have a situation where LSAC seems to be caught unawares about what is occurring? This just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. One of the students that follows me on Twitter had said, this is the same situation that we had with the lifetime limitation on testing that came out this summer. It's like it was released almost through the side door at a conference, and there was nothing official said, and it was only after there was this huge clamor online that LSAC came out and made an official statement. It appears that they are behind the curve on this, and I have said many times in this podcast, and you certainly have as well, get out in front of problems. You're talking about thousands of students who take your test every year, 6 figures worth of students. They're going to want to know what's happening with the test. And the first thing I started seeing online was, does this mean it'll be the same test next year? I can't answer that question because the people who make the test aren't giving us information. And boy, they really need a communications crisis team to handle things like, hey, we're canceling your test the day before. Hey, your tablets didn't arrive. There's been a weather problem and we don't know how to reschedule the test. Or we're changing your lifetime limitation, but we didn't really make an official announcement. We just told all the law school counselors.
You'll have a makeup test in the next 2 weeks. You might not have the 24 hours notice, though.
Or finally, we're thinking maybe we might remove logic games, but, it's only, as you said, the most notorious, infamous, feared section on this test. Obviously, people would want to know about it. But if this is true, the way you released it was through a press release that you didn't even release under your own name on a random Tuesday morning. What are you doing? I do not understand it. And so I will say this, and then I'll get off this podium or whatever it is.
No, you won't. No,
I'll
you
try.
won't.
I consider myself to be a reporter of record for what LSAC does. And reporting on their goings on is a really important thing for us to do because accountability is important. These are people who are working with individuals who are going to become lawyers. They need to be held to the highest possible standard. Many of them are lawyers, certainly in the administration and so forth. They can do better than this. They should do better than this. And I find it astonishing that we're even having this conversation. They should have had a press release ready to go 30 minutes after this came out that said, we're glad to have done this. The tests will be will be changing or will be the same. We'll release more information within the next 2 days that talks about this and where we're going with it. So that's my 2 cents on it.
No, I mean,
irritated.
Look, both of us hate having to play the fourth estate in this, right? Like, I don't want to be the press corps for LSAC's opacity.
No.
But somebody's got to talk about this stuff because they clearly won't.
They are caught in an era of 10 to 15 years ago, and where it's like nobody asked them questions. They didn't have to answer to things like this. And you are now living in an on-demand, instantaneous world where we can see everything that you do. You cancel on somebody in New York, we're going to know about it within 20 to 30 minutes. You don't have tablets arrive in Berkeley. Guess what? 20 people are going to post about it.
Yep. And they've proven themselves responsive to complaint. They didn't move this November registration at a whim. They did it because people complained.
And that's a great example of them being responsive.
Yeah.
They did this with score release as
Perfect
well.
example.
When we were like, choose a date, choose a time, and go ahead and release it. I wrote a blog about it. I was like, open letter to LSAC. And they actually responded to it, and they have done this. And that's a great example of like, hey, we hear you, we're responsive. They actually said that in their tweet. We've heard what you said. And they do this. They can do it. They have the ability. It's just the new administration is making so many changes that I think sometimes it's like, wait, the communication side is the last side to get it. And I believe that the people that they have there are good. Their new communications director hasn't been there that long. So there is a pass that is there. But it's also a left-hand, right thing.
That's what I said earlier, is the left hand really doesn't know what the right is doing and vice versa a lot of times.
It could be that the comm team is like, what are you guys doing? We haven't heard anything about this.
What lawsuit?
Yeah, there's also another, aside from them seeming unawares and for it to be rather ridiculous and amazing for it to come out this way, it could be because they didn't read it this way. They might have been caught completely off guard by the interpretation.
Yeah.
Because what Kelly Testy says in her quote in that press release doesn't allude to this in the least.
As I said to the lawyer, Jason Turkish, I was like, let's never forget how slippery LSAC can be. I won't tell you what he said back, but I don't think anyone who's dealt with LSAC would necessarily disagree with the fact that if there's a way for them to feel as though they have, quote, lived up to their part of a deal, but that also benefits them in the process to the maximum degree, that's the path they're going to take. I think there is a way that they could satisfy the language in that without necessarily having to satisfy the intent on the litigating party.
That's exactly right. They may have looked at that statement and said,
works for me. All people will have access to this thing. We are going to enable it. Let me point to one other part of that quote that to me stood out, Dave, and not to keep circling back to this, but, well, here we are.
Good.
The other part was this. It will enable all prospective law students to take an exam administered by LSAC that does not have the current AR section, Analytical Reasoning Logic Game section. An exam administered by LSAC. Why not frame that as we'll be able to take an LSAT without the AR section, or we will no longer include analytical reasoning on the LSAT? Why not make it completely unambiguous, completely cut and dry? An exam administered by it? That's like an exam with extra time, an exam with larger font, an exam with an interpreter, an audio speaker if you have hearing difficulties.
And this could easily be the case of two different views. The law firm and the plaintiffs thinking, okay, what they've agreed to is this, and LSAC thinking, no, what we've agreed to is this.
Yeah. And on the case of the law firm, entirely possible as I can see it. The law firm and the plaintiff, they've got to be satisfied with that because individually, at least partially satisfied, individually they are going to get to take a test that doesn't have logic games, that doesn't have this visual spatial reasoning component, diagramming component. But did they win a battle for the greater good out there? Or did they win a landscape shifting battle that changes the nature of the entire test for everyone? That's a lot harder to say at this point.
It really is. And it's an interesting thing to think that one or two people...
I know they think they did.
I think it's quite clear in the press release they think they did. It's right there in black and white that they're saying that this is a major change. And I've had some people say already to me, they're like, I'm not sure I think it's fair because, one person had an issue. Why can't they just accommodate that person, give them a similar experience, and then everyone else keeps on taking the same test?
Right.
One of the first questions I got was, no, not logic games. Get rid of reading comprehension instead.
Was that me? Was I the one that said that?
No, but I support that view. Like I said, going back to this, the reason they didn't control the narrative, one possible explanation of that is they might not have thought that this was going to be the narrative. They may not have believed that this was the case. And so I'm hoping that what will happen is that tomorrow we will get a message from the LSAC administration that either says, yes, indeed, this is our plan to change this test, and we'll be releasing more information later on this fall or next year, or alternately, that's not our interpretation. We have no plans to change, in the immediate future, the nature of the LSAT. Then again, go back to the blog they had out recently where they talked about, we're always studying changes to the LSAT. We might make it shorter.
Right.
We could look at different aspects of the questions. They have open doors in every single direction. There is definitely an interpretation here where you could say, looks really strong that they're going to change the logic games. There's a much smaller window that says, maybe not.
Yeah, I think that's right. I won't put percentages on it as much as I want to, but this is far from open and shut as I see it.
Well, it's certainly more than 50% for the change.
Wholesale change. Everybody gets no games.
That press release is really strong.
Yeah, it really is. And not only strong, but the intent behind it is even stronger. It's very clear what the authors of the press release intended to mean.
Yeah, and they were the plaintiffs here, and they were able to reach a settlement, so they feel some degree of vindication, and that something, at least, will be changed. I think we know that much.
That is true.
Some portion of the test to at least some people is going to change.
There will be a future LSAT without logic games. Who gets to take it, who has to take it, that's what I think is still a little murky here.
Yep.
It raises raises a bunch of, how do you equate that with people applying the same year as you with the test from 4 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago?
Don't know.
Yeah.
I do know that Angelo Bino says, and he's the plaintiff, says towards the end of the article, I'm looking forward to a day when I will be able to take this test without logic games. And to be entirely honest, I sympathize with his situation, and I've always thought that from an accommodation standpoint, that if you were sight impaired, that taking the logic game section is a really, really big and rather unfair ask. So I get exactly where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Let's actually move on and talk about what would happen in a world where they actually did take out logic games. Now, I'm going to start by saying I hope they don't. I love the logic game section. I feel like it's the section that is the easiest to improve upon on this test and that you can see huge gains. It's part of the reason we chose that song, Ain't No Sunshine, because I'm like, that would bum me out, man. That's why I'm drinking a screwdriver, because I'm thinking I would feel screwed by it. And of course,
that's why this tequila's so salty.
You're still crying over there.
Yeah.
Stop the tears.
I know.
I would hate to see that happen because I think it's an incredibly unique piece of test making. I think it's made it at a really high level. And I love the fact that we can make people go from getting 6 right to getting 22 right on that kind of section.
Yeah,
and
although all the more reason that it's an unfair disadvantage to someone like Angelo. Here he is. It's not just that he's penalized by this one section that requires you to see things. It's that he's missing the opportunity on the single greatest section to improve in.
And when I'm speaking about that, I'm not talking about him. For him, I think it's radically unfair, and I think he should actually be given a test without analytical reasoning.
As I said to Jason a couple times today, I said, look, congratulations. Like, my sense of social justice here is entirely in your court. I think this is a big win, and Angelo and others deserve it.
Yeah. I don't love it for what we do because it's less fun. If they take the logic game section away, there's a couple different things that they can do, aside from making me sadder than I am right now.
All right, time out. This is John. This has already been something of a unique, maybe even strange episode in that so far Dave and I have really only focused on developments with LSAC and with test updates and recent announcements. Well, the strangeness is going to continue here very briefly for just a moment because I am actually recording a post-recording update, an interjection of sorts that I'm going to insert right here. Now, Dave and I have just spent some time discussing really LSAC's non-response as this announcement came down the pike and caused a lot of chaos today and will continue, I'm sure, to ruffle feathers going forward. And what we've been doing is discussing that LSAC needs to be more proactive, needs to be more transparent. If they know these kinds of things are coming and that the, again, feedback loop that's going to get created is going to be fairly deafening for them, for us, for everyone, and there's going to be confusion that abounds, they have the opportunity to preempt that. I stand by every one of those statements that Dave made and that I made, and I strongly encourage them to get better about that. As of the recording itself, which happened earlier today, we still had not heard anything from LSAC, despite a full business day having passed. But after the recording, since then, we actually did hear from them, and that's why I'm coming to you now with this 11th hour interjection. They sent out a letter to people that outlines in some detail what it is really that they're up to here. I'll do a couple of things for you as part of this. One is I will link to a full set of the letter's text, so you can actually go and read it for yourself, and I encourage you to pause this if you get a chance and do so, or to at least put it in the back of your mind to read this as soon as you get a chance, if you're listening to this like on a train or in your car or something. Go read their letter, see what it is that they say. But what I want to do, very briefly here, is pinpoint a couple of what I feel are the most salient or the most revealing, perhaps, talking points within their 4-5 paragraph letter that they sent out, email that they sent out, and draw your attention not only to those, but give you my takeaways or my interpretation of what they mean with some of their, again, typically obscure and somewhat slippery, murky language. The first thing, in the third of 4 paragraphs, there's a line where they do, in fact, allude to the test changing. Specifically, here's what they say, and again, I'm quoting. We will continue to assess the analytical reasoning abilities of prospective law students while we redesign the way in which that skill is assessed. And obviously, there's some vocal inflection for emphasis there. While we redesign the way in which that skill, analytical reasoning, which is logic games, is assessed, is being tested. They do say that. That is really, though, the only point in this entire message where they even allude to the fact that changes are more or less going to occur. So when I hear them say that, here's what I think. They never go so far as to say anything remotely like logic games are going to disappear or be removed, either individually or as a section. They never talk about that throughout the letter, and I'll continue to emphasize that as we go. Instead, what I suspect could well happen, Dave and I are going to explore this idea at the end of my little interjection here. We'll talk about possible ways that they could replace games or things that they could do to continue to test these skills without necessarily having to do a wholesale revision or wholesale creation for the section. But what I suspect is very likely here, if they do make changes to this section, as seems reasonably certain, is that I think they could create an amended form of logic games. Those could take shape, where you'd get a lessened emphasis on things like spatial reasoning, which is really the heart of the matter here and the heart of the issue, and a greater emphasis on skills like conditional reasoning, for instance, or non-visual pattern recognition, where you talk about things like linkages or chains, groups in and out, separations and things. Those don't require the same sorts of like visualization that a lot of the games in their current form do, or just general inference making. These are all skills that are tested elsewhere on the test, primarily in logical reasoning, as I'm sure you know, and that I think would be far less reliant on the necessity of a diagram, which was, again, really the crux of this whole thing, that visually impaired people who aren't able to diagram, aren't able to see the game itself, were at a massive disadvantage. And Dave and I have already talked in this episode about the fact that we agree with that assessment. So that's really the only place in this letter where they seem to imply with some strength that games are going to change. In fact, when I say with some strength and that there's additional hedging, let me point out a few further lines in this message that are, I think, equally, if not more revealing about what's in store. So to kind of double down on this idea, this interpretation of things may not be quite as final, quite as inevitable as they may have sounded from what you may have heard yesterday. Not from us, but just from the general whirlwind, the cacophony of interpretations. Here's another line from their email. It says, "We have committed to research alternative ways to assess analytical reasoning skills with the goal of completing that research in the next 4 years." And again, emphasis mine on the word research twice in that line, but note that that makes this feel a lot more exploratory, a lot more searching and seeking and, again, undefined than predetermined or, like I said, inevitable. Note, too, in that what they're talking about as a 4-year deadline is not a new test. They're saying they intend to complete their research about how to potentially administer a different analytical reasoning assessment within those 4 years. And I'll talk more about the process that would follow on the heels of that as well. So even into 2023, perhaps, which is 4 years off, give or take, it could still be that they come back and say, like, okay, we think we figured out how to do this. And there's another year or more where they begin to pre-test and deliver materials and get feedback and try to do A/B testing, cross-comparison, a lot like they did with the digital rollout, where they tested in multiple pilot instances how this new format might actually come to pass or play out. Another line, and this to me is, again, very revealing, quote, "Should there be any significant changes to format, ... Again, listen to that language. Should there be any significant changes? Not when changes occur, or, we feel these changes will be significant or won't be so significant as to disrupt. There's none of that. It's very, as I said in a different post, it's dripping with indecision. And one more, another quote that, again, I think really pulls back on the reins from some of the certainty that people were feeling earlier, says, "It's too early in the process to speculate on how the test will evolve." So, as I said before, anybody starting to stack up the Logic Games funeral pyre here or carve out Logic Games tombstone, that is way premature at this point. They don't know how the test will evolve. Should there be significant changes? They're only committing right now to research. There is a lot of this where they are far, far removed from the finality that I think a lot of people were hearing or sensing in the wake of this initial press release. So again, take all of what you've heard so far with a grain of salt beyond this podcast where we have basically been tossing a grain of salt back and forth since the outset. One more point to make, and this was at the end of their message. They say this: "If any changes do occur, quote, several stages of pilot testing and data analysis would be required to ensure the continued validity, reliability, and fairness of the test." In other words, we'll know well in advance not only what some future amended version of the LSAT might look like were it to come to pass, but we'll also have official content from LSAC where people can prepare for it, where we, as prep companies, can analyze it and begin to talk strategies and discuss the best methods of attack, the techniques that are going to be most appropriate to deconstruct and really solve whatever analytical reasoning tests they bring to bear. It reminds me a lot, and we mentioned this earlier in the podcast episode, again, it reminds me a lot of the rollout of comparative reading back in June of 2007, where months and months in advance, I don't want to say how many, but I think it was at least like 5 or 6 months in advance, they were like, look, this test is going to change starting June. Here's how it's going to change. Here are multiple passage sets that you can actually see what you'll be doing. Now, granted, a reading comp adjustment from a single passage to a double is a far less, potentially far less, ground-shaking, earth-shattering change than replacing Logic Games with some other task. Again, we have no idea what that might be if it even happens. But we will have plenty of runway lead up into whatever the future version of this test may in fact become. So again, go read their full email when you get a chance to do it. But those to me were the key things to take away from it. We are far, far from feeling like Logic Games is at death's door here. With that in mind, I will let you return back to the pre-recorded episode that you've been listening to so far. Thanks for your time.
So let's speculate on where they could go with this. Because
right.
The first thing is, let's say they remove it and they don't replace it with a new section of some different type.
Okay.
If that's the case, they could do a couple different things. They could maybe add a third logical reasoning section that's scored.
That seems the most likely to me, probably the most useful to me, if they're going to keep the current content only.
Agreed.
Yeah.
They could double up reading comprehension and have 2 LR and 2 RC. I mean, logical reasoning is like a really good section for this test. It's exactly the kind of thing that lawyers do in terms of thinking about argumentation.
I agree.
I could see 3 sections of that and 1 of reading comp. I would not be thrilled to live in a world that was 2 logical reasoning and 2 reading comprehension.
Not be thrilled.
It's my diplomatic way of saying it would totally suck. I want to enjoy my life. I love doing test preparation. I love talking to people about the LSAT. It's the entirety of the test. A 50-50 LR-RC test, oh man, I don't know if I can live in that world.
Yeah, no, you'll have to excuse me. I'm going to go lay in traffic. That is my nightmare, dude.
Now, let's say that they were like, no, we're going to replace it. Mm-hmm. There's a couple different ways they can go with this. One thing is that I was speculating with someone earlier today was, what if they took the writing sample and made it an actual scored part of the test?
You know, there's something to be said for that. You do a lot of writing in law school. Obviously, lawyers aren't immune to it either. So to say that we're going to evaluate your writing skills, that makes sense.
It really does. And there's also precedent for scored writing sections.
On the LSAT or elsewhere, or both?
Not on the LSAT, but on other tests, which tells you that it is possible.
Just about every other major test that people have heard of has scored writing. GRE, GMAT, SAT, ACT, nearly every one.
Exactly. So they could, if they were to replace the logic games, and once again, for anybody listening, I hope they don't, they could replace it with a scored writing section, and this would dovetail very nicely with the overall stated mission. The thing that I will say, though, is at that point, tell me exactly how different this is from GRE verbal.
Right.
You know you're about to be in a long-term war with the GRE. Should you really be making your test more and more similar to theirs? Boy, that undermines a lot of your positions that you could make out there about differences between the test and how the LSAT is made for law school and things of that nature.
Let's talk a little bit about GRE verbal and GMAT verbal, because even now, currently, there is a lot of overlap. GMAT verbal has critical reasoning, for instance. It's just logical reasoning watered down a little bit, frankly.
A light version of LR.
Yeah. LITE, light. GRE has, again, short passages. It's a lot like LR, long passages like reading comp. GMAT has long passages. GMAT includes grammar. GRE includes vocabulary.
Yeah,
but those
sentence
are really
correction being the GMAT.
Yeah,
it's a tough set of questions.
That's the grammar-based question type, and the GRE has text completion and sentence equivalence, which are just vocab tests, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they're not identical. There are differences there, but they're much more language-oriented in terms of like the mechanics of what you're doing and how you understand the contextual use of language and so forth.
Exactly, yeah.
Which, by the way, sure seems interesting to me if from a legal perspective, because you do need to understand those things.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, this conversation is predicated on multiple interpretations of a somewhat ambiguous sentence.
Yeah.
There we go.
It really is.
Yeah.
So maybe LSAC goes down that pathway where they're like, language is a big part of being a lawyer. Let's do some kind of language-oriented section.
But does that test analytical reasoning skills, which was the last part of that sentence?
I don't think so.
I don't either.
Analytical reasoning is more about the structural relationship of ideas and understanding facts and consequences.
Seeing patterns, yeah.
Yeah, what happens when conditions change, when something must be true versus when it could be true and so forth. I don't think a language-based test like that does that. I think you could make the argument that a writing section that was structured the proper way could get close to it. The other thing that crossed my mind was the idea that they could go back to some of the types of questions they've used in the past. Mm-hmm. And so I actually pulled up a document that I have that is relatively old, very old, actually.
Relative to?
Yeah, well, to all of us.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Loop me into that.
It's from years ago. It's a compendium of LSAC question types that were used for the LSAT. And one of the things that you see that they repeatedly tried to do was to come up with questions that reflected a basic analysis of cases, mm-hmm. where they would give you information and they would talk about the relevance of that information, or these are the facts of the case, which direction is it going to go. The most recently that this was used was in the 1980s, from 1982 to 1989. Mm-hmm. There was a section on the LSAT. It was one of the 4 scored sections called Facts and Issues. And a lot of people call that dispute characterization. The facts and issues was, they would give you a set of facts and you'd kind of go from there in terms of interpreting it. The only problem was when they did an analysis of the predictive validity of that section, they found that it really didn't have any predictive validity. And so they removed it in 1989 and expanded the other 3 sections, which were reading comp, logical reasoning, and logic games, made those longer.
Yeah.
Each section was actually 45 minutes. And then they didn't like that, so in 1991, they took it back down to 35 minutes, doubled the LR.
I do want to note it managed to survive for 7 years before they were like, hey, you know what? This does no good predicting people.
Now, that's also built upon the test-making capacities of the 80s, and I've said many times, those questions from the 80s are like the Wild West.
Yeah.
There's some brutally difficult stuff. There's some super easy stuff. The language is like fast and loose. It's the topics are all over the place. Zeus and the gods of the trees. It's just crazy. So it could be that they could revisit something like that, and that would make a lot of sense because if you had something that was more like factual and case level analysis without the legal principles, it could certainly work into somebody's ability to analytically break down that kind of information and see whether or not they have really strong analytical reasoning skills.
Yeah.
So that's an option for them, again, if they were to remove logic games, and we're not totally sure that's going to happen.
Right.
So choices for them, that would be a tidal wave, a tsunami, a massive earthquake rolling through this field, because that would force everybody to go back to step 1 and rebuild what they're doing for that section.
Yeah.
So, obviously, I would have preferences.
Including us, by the way.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And that doesn't bother me. I'm like, well, that's just the way that it is. I just would hope that it would be interesting. What I like about the LSAT is I find it fascinating. I think it's well made. I think the questions are kind of cool. I really enjoy solving them. It's like a puzzle. Mm-hmm. What I don't want is something that I feel is boring.
Yeah, and dry. Let me circle back to something from before. I know there's at least one person out there wondering, could it be algebra? Could it be geometry? Am I going to see math in 4 years on the LSAT? And I think the answer is a pretty clear no. Not only would that then duplicate even more the GMAT and the GRE, if you recall Dave's little rundown of the top 10 most important things according to law school faculty, you may recall that geometry only got 2%, highly important. Algebra, I think, got 4%. That is not going to be a priority for LSAC if it is that low a priority for the people they're trying to basically cater to in pushing this test, which is the law schools themselves. So if you're math phobic, while I would deeply encourage you to try to cure that, I don't think you're going to have to worry about it on this test.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were able to take a very clear message from that survey that they did and that we talked about earlier, that math isn't the thing they want to get into. This isn't going to be a data interpretation section.
Which is a GMAT thing.
Yeah, and you're not going to see anything along those lines. So I think we're actually good. So really the big question is, what comes up next? Where do we go from here?
Well, look, the big question mark is clearly in LSAC's court at this point. Until they make an official announcement, which, again, I hate this to even surmise, but they may not. But until they do, when they do, we're really kind of stuck wondering, right?
We are. And right now, I'm like one of those people waiting for their score coming back.
That's how I feel about this, too. Except we might have my 4 years. Yeah.
Here it is.
Yeah.
The day is ending. And I'm like F5ing my email, is there a message from LSAC there? Where's my LSAC message?
Yeah. The spoiled students
really
out there they wait 3 weeks and complain. We might be waiting 3 years.
Responded. This is, I don't understand it. It's a yes or no question. And if you want to spin it, that's great, but it doesn't take 2 days to spin it. So
why might they keep the cards, say, closer to the vest? Do you think they're worried about a test drop-off in 3 years if they reveal this too soon?
They're going to get that regardless of when they reveal it. You'll probably get the usual increase in the number of test takers towards the end of the change cycle. And then when the new test kicks in, the number of people taking it typically drops.
Yeah, we saw it when they changed the SAT. It was a huge spike right before, and then it fell off, like plummeted off.
Happened with the GMAT as well. So that's kind of like a normal thing that people run into in this field when they make tests, is like any kind of like significant change is met with that pattern. So I don't think it's that. I think they want to get their announcement right. I think we can say that they've already blown the announcement, because if it turns out to be true and they weren't ahead of this, I just don't get it. I've already ranted about that, so I won't say anything more other than I'm just dismayed. I'm hoping that they're like, we didn't know this was going to be an issue. That's not our interpretation. We love logic games. It's our favorite section, and we're going to have it on the LSAT for 50 years. That would make me happy.
That made me very happy.
But no matter what, we hope that, they will say something about it. That change, if there is to be one, is not official until LSAC says that it is. And then even if they say that it is, keep this in mind. They have up to 4 years. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen in January. They have years. And typically when there are test changes from them, they will announce it beforehand. If it's a significant content change, they give you advance notice that says, on this date, the test will be altered.
Yeah, like comparative reading back in June of 7. Yeah.
Yes, that's the best example. It's going to change and it is coming. Or the digital LSAT here in July. Hey, we're going to do this. We're going to let you know. That's something that they really are obligated to do in their position, and they have met that obligation over time. So they've done a great job communicating things like that. Just don't think they thought this was going to be that big of a deal. I'm not even sure they thought anyone would see that press release or care about it. And so maybe they weren't ready, and maybe they don't interpret it this way. But we'll have to wait and see. As soon as we hear from them, we'll be communicating it on all the normal social channels that we have. And if it's a big enough deal, we'll probably just record another fast podcast and be like, what?
Yeah, here's the final word, guys.
And if it's like, yeah, we're changing it, it might be a short one. A lot of swearing.
That's right.
They're going to change it. Damn. And then it gets worse from there.
It does get worse from there, I promise.
John, any closing comments?
I mean, no.
Well, I'm pretty much out of Sunny D here, so I need a refill.
Happily, I've got more tequila. So,
all right. Well, everybody, thanks so much for listening this week. We'll keep you posted on what happens in the wild west world of LSAC, who don't seem to know which direction the horse is riding at all times. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, or anywhere else you find it. Give us a rating, and if you have questions, send them to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com or even lsat@powerscore.com. And we'll try to get to answering those in the next couple of weeks. So on my behalf and John's, thanks so much for listening. Have a great week. Until the next time.